bienvenidos, bienvenidas a todas las personas, a los grupos, a las organizaciones, a los países, a las panelistas presentes en este espacio virtual, el encuentro internacional, el techo es un derecho, poder común contra las ejecuciones y los desahucios. Llegamos. Mi nombre es Ariadna Godraubert, yo soy abogada de derechos humanos y además tengo el honor de ser la fundadora y directora de Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, una organización que por los últimos años nos hemos dedicado a promover apoderamiento legal y abogacía de impacto social para lograr vivienda digna y recuperación justa. Hoy nos convoca la consigna del derecho al techo. Nos convoca la certeza de que el quédate en tu casa, que ha venido a ser eslogan de campañas globales, de campañas regionales o locales de salud, que ha sido el hashtag en redes sociales a lo largo de la pandemia, quédate en tu casa, poco tiene que ver con la realidad de los millones de personas que viven en techos inseguros. Y esto es más cierto aún ante desastres económicos, desastres políticos, desastres climáticos, una pandemia. Y amplifica la inseguridad en la vivienda como un divisor entre las vidas que importan, quienes pueden sobrevivir un desastre y las que no. Si algo hace la crisis de vivienda es que nos desposee, nos quita los cuerpos, nos quita los hogares, nos quita a nuestras comunidades. A quien no puede pagar la renta o la hipoteca en un sistema capitalista, racista, profundamente injusto, se le llena de culpa, de vergüenza, de soledad. Enunciar, reconocer, defender el derecho al techo es un espacio de acompañamiento individual y colectivo. Nadie pierde la casa porque quiere. Decir no estás sola. Decir desde ahí, quédate en tu casa, como una advertencia a los grandes intereses. Y también decir, quédate en tu casa, como una promesa de solidaridad mutua. Esto nos convoca hoy. Nos convoca la certeza de que construimos poder. Y hablando de poder, quería empezar reconociendo la presencia del equipo que hace posible Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico y reconocer el poder en ustedes. David, Iris, Cristina, Frances, Yarelis, Noeli, Verónica, Mariluli, Madeline, Camilo. Quiero reconocer el poder de las personas panelistas que dijeron que sí, que hicieron espacio intencional en sus agendas cargadas y que llegaron para tener esta conversación. Quiero reconocer el poder de las intérpretes, la cooperativa Brújula que siempre nos conecta. Quiero reconocer todo el poder en este espacio y el poder en sus respectivos espacios. El poder en las personas y organizaciones que han dedicado años a la defensa de la vivienda digna y a la justicia de tierras. El poder de quienes nos preceden y que nos inspiran. También quiero reconocer la ausencia de quienes nos faltan, entregadas a la lucha por el derecho al techo, arrancadas de sus hogares y sus comunidades, de quienes han muerto esperando asistencia de desastre, una cama en un hospital que sirva de refugio durante una pandemia, un acuerdo justo de un banco, una pausa en una larga cadena de desahucios, un techo seguro. Hay una humanidad que se pierde cuando se le reconoce a un juzgado, a un tribunal, a una autoridad municipal, a una fuerza militar, la capacidad de decidir si una persona dormirá esta noche bajo un techo seguro. Nadie debe morir sin techo. Nadie debe vivir sin techo. Y aunque ningún lenguaje es responsable en sí mismo de la desigualdad, yo decidí comenzar este encuentro en español de manera bien intencional. Aunque el COVID nos impide estar reunidas en casa, que para nosotras es este archipiélago que es Puerto Rico, el encuentro El Derecho al Techo es una forma de traerles, de mostrarles, de pedir colaboración, solidaridad internacional en la lucha por la vivienda digna. El nuestro es un territorio ocupado, empobrecido, puesto en manos de especuladores y fondos buitres que nos quitan las tierras y las casas con impunidad. Este espacio colonizado es también un espacio donde se construye poder, desde donde se acompaña y se defiende el derecho al techo porque literalmente se nos va la vida en ello. Y este encuentro internacional es también una apuesta al Puerto Rico que queremos, descolonizado, solidario, internacionalista. Y aunque no ha llegado el tiempo de los abrazos, ya pronto volverá. Así que a todas las personas que se nos unen en el día de hoy, bienvenidas a casa. En el día de hoy vamos a tener, y mañana vamos a tener una agenda bien cargada. Vamos a tener gente que viene de distintos países del mundo, incluyendo Brasil, Argentina, Canadá, Sudáfrica. Tenemos personas que vienen asistiendo también de distintas jurisdicciones, además de obviamente nuestras compañeras y compañeros de Estados Unidos. Como parte del llamado a la solidaridad que vamos a estar haciendo en este espacio, además de conversaciones sobre temas de hipotecas y de desahucios, que rara vez las tenemos en Puerto Rico, se les está pidiendo que como parte del trabajo se comparta un manifiesto de 5 puntos clave para el cual hemos estado recogiendo endosos y que se convertirá en una plataforma de acción de Puerto Rico, pero también de otros espacios, para seguir defendiendo el techo con conceptos de derechos humanos. Les pedimos que mantengan sus cámaras prendidas, que por favor reaccionen, hagan preguntas, comentarios utilizando el chat, que lo hagan en el lenguaje de su preferencia. Les pedimos por favor que compartan en redes sociales con el hashtag derecho al techo, y les pedimos por favor que cuando lo hagan desde su experiencia, desde su humanidad. Ahora me corresponde, para comenzar, presentar a nuestra primera panelista, que es la compañera Leilani Fara. Lo voy a hacer en inglés para poder fluir la conversación con ella. Y entonces, desde aquí comenzamos. Pero qué bueno tenerles aquí. So it is with great honor, and it is a great I would say that it's a chance that we have been waiting for a long time, to have among us Leilani Fara, who is a person that has been doing important work around the right to housing at international levels. And most of the work that we are going to be presenting today, the frameworks that we are going to be sharing with you all, are part of the work that she has been pushing for the last few years. So thank you, Leilani, for being here. I'm going to quickly read a bio that doesn't make justice to the work that she has been doing for a while. Leilani is the global director of the Shift, an international movement to secure the right to housing, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. The Shift was launched in 2017 with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and United Cities and Local Governments, and works with multi-level stakeholders around the world, including with several city governments in North America and Europe. Leilani's work is animated by the principle that housing is a social good and not a commodity. She has helped develop global human rights standards on the right to housing, including through her topical reports on homelessness, the financialization of housing, informal settlements, rights-based housing strategies, and the first UN guidelines for the implementation of the right to housing. She is the central character in the award-winning documentary Push regarding the financialization of housing. Push is screening around the world, and to continue its momentum, Leilani and Frederick now co-host a podcast, Pushback Talks, about finance, housing, and human rights. Thank you for being here, Leilani. Leilani, you're muted. Let me see if we can help you. We are live, so this will happen.
Thank you so much for unmuting me. It is a real pleasure to be here today. In Canada, before we speak, we always acknowledge the lands upon which we live and work. And so I'd like to do my land acknowledgement before I make my comments, if that's all right. So I live in a city called Ottawa, and I live very close to a river. The river is now called the Ottawa River, but in fact, it used to be called the Kitchissippi River. And it was the lands of an Indigenous tribe and community called the Anishinaabe. And the river was a place for the Anishinaabe to come together on both sides of the river and experience community. They would gather there. Since colonialization or colonization, the river is renamed the Ottawa River, and it was used to divide English-speaking people in Canada from French-speaking people. It was used to divide religion, Catholics from Anglicans. And it has been used to destroy the communal aspect of the river and has become a form of political division. So that is the river that I walk by every morning before this convening. I walked my dog there this morning, and I'm able to reflect on colonialism and its divisive power every day. And it grounds me as I come back to my office, sit at my desk, and do the work that I do on housing rights. So thank you again for inviting me to this really important event. I want to tell you that when I first was appointed UN rapporteur back in 2014, I had the occasion to be a judge in a award for interesting housing projects. And the first year that I was a judge, a project came to my attention from Puerto Rico. It was a project from Cano Martin Peña, and it was a community land trust project. It was the first time that I came very close and got to know the idea of using a land trust to directly challenge speculation. And so I feel so pleased to be here today, knowing about that project. I don't know the status of it now. Since then, of course, there was the hurricane in 2017. There has been a lot of speculative pressure on Puerto Rico. So I would love to receive an update about that community. But just to say that I have long felt there is very important work to be done in Puerto Rico because of your special status. I consider it special status vis-a-vis the United States. And because you have every element of housing pressure on you. You have the big speculators, you have people supposedly without legal land title, you have deep and entrenched poverty, you have issues of indigeneity and real issues of entitlement at stake. And so as I said, this is a very important conversation, and Puerto Rico is in a very particular place. I was asked to speak about three things, so I will try to limit myself to those three things and keep within time. I want to begin by just a comment on financialization. So the definition that I use, for those who aren't familiar, this is such an awkward word. I don't know it in Spanish, but even in English, it's like financialization. No one can pronounce it. No one really understands. And in fact, I think we aren't supposed to understand. Those of us who aren't inside of it, I think we're not supposed to understand. But it's a very simple thing, in fact. It is this. It's when housing, your home, my home, your neighbor's home, is used as an asset. In other words, it's used as a commodity. It's used as a place to park, grow, leverage, and hide big money. That's all financialization is. And I'll just repeat it. It's a place when financialization of housing is when housing is used as a place to park, grow, leverage, and hide big money. And it's often done by big institutions. Now, it can be done by individuals, but what you're worried about in Puerto Rico mostly are the big private equity firms, TPG, for example, who owns so many of your manufactured home communities. And I'm not sure if they're still active there, but they certainly were in 2017 and 2018. It's these big private equity firms that we know named on the mainland, Blackstone, Wedgwood. I don't know all of the ones active in Puerto Rico, but no doubt you have them there. When we look at individuals, it's individuals of what we call ultra high net worth. In other words, uber rich individuals, billionaires, and they are flocking to Puerto Rico, as you know, buying up land. So that's where individuals come in. Why is financialization of interest to me? I mean, I'm a human rights lawyer. Why would I care about housing finance and all of these big deals that are happening? It's because financialization undermines the human right to housing in two main ways. First, it challenges security of tenure. Your security, your knowledge that you can remain in your home is challenged when financial actors are out there looking for land to purchase. Think about in Puerto Rico, all of you probably know someone whose mortgage has foreclosed. All of you probably know someone who had a reverse mortgage and that mortgage has been foreclosed. 1/3 of mortgages in your country are in default right now. So you think, well, of course, those people do not have security, right? They're fearful that their home will be taken away from them by the banks. But we have to understand what banks do when they have a foreclosed mortgage on their books. They call that bad debt, and they sell bad debt cheap, and they sell it to the big financial actors who will then purchase it cheap, 50 cents on the dollar, 30 cents on the dollar. And then they will flip that home into something else for a different class of people. They will even, in fact, have the audacity to rent it back to households that were once owners, and they will increase those rents and increase those rents. And that's the second concern with financialization of housing. Not just the insecurity it causes, but also the unaffordability it causes. In many ways, it results in rent increases, it puts pressure on land, it makes accommodation more expensive. And so we say it drives up the overall cost of housing. Even if you think of your individuals of ultra high net worth, I don't know, I think you have some like famous people who own homes in Puerto Rico, some famous Latin singers, for example. When they purchase a home for $5 million US dollars or $7 million US dollars or $2 million US dollars, and then they flip it and sell it for $7 million US dollars, it escalates the entire cost of housing. It puts a value on the land. It says suddenly, and it's a fiction, it is fiction, it's created, but it puts a value on the land. Suddenly this parcel of land was worth 7 million. So that informal settlement that's near that piece of land suddenly becomes very interesting for those with money, because if we can get rid of the people living there, we can put mansions on those lands and get a lot of money off of those lands. That's how financialization works. And that's why it's such a threat to the human right to housing, because the human right to housing means only one thing: the right to live in peace, with security, and with dignity. The unaffordability of housing and the insecurity of housing challenges that definition of the right to housing. And we all know, we don't need definitions. In fact, we know, we feel it in our bodies when we are living without our human rights, when we are fearful that we will lose our home, that our children will become homeless, that our parents and our grandparents will become homeless. We know that that is a violation of what it is to be a human being. So what does human rights law say in terms of who is accountable for all of this? Can this just happen? Can private actors just run free? Can the private market just do what it does? Not really. And that's where human rights law is so important. Human rights law provides accountability. That's the beauty of human rights. And that's why I am committed to the framework. That's, in fact, all human rights is. Many years ago, after World War II, it was understood that if we leave human beings to their own devices, if we let humans just do what they want to do, humans lose their moral compass. And to redirect that moral compass, if you think about the atrocities of World War II, to redirect that moral compass, society came up with a set of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. And that declaration says that everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living, including housing. And I would suggest that if we leave housing to these corporate actors who do not have individual interests at the heart of their businesses, that we have lost our moral compass. And we need to bring these actors back in line with an accepted, universal, agreed upon moral compass that housing is a human right. And it is the obligation of governments to do this. And I want to be very clear. So that is the government of the United States of America, President Joe Biden. That is all of the levels of government in Puerto Rico. Every level of government has a responsibility and a human rights obligation to ensure those corporate actors are not undermining the right to housing. And that doesn't just mean preventing them from doing harm. That's important. They have to prevent them from doing harm. But it also means ensuring that when you invite private actors into the housing sector, they do good. They actually contribute to the social value of housing. So it's not enough to say to a private actor, oh, okay, you can come, but don't evict. That's important. That's important. It's essential. But you have to say more. You can say, you can come, but you cannot evict, and you have to build and contribute to an affordable housing stock, or you have to contribute to ensure we can have the regularization of land title. In other words, you have to help us create systems so that people's land title is recognized. There's many leverage points. If investors want to come, you could allow them in, but on human rights terms. Allow them in on human rights terms and ask yourself what that looks like. I also want to say that the human rights framework is one that applies to everything and anything that touches on the right to housing. So it's not just to focus on housing programs and policies. So for example, the HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, the federal government provides Puerto Rico with funds for housing. Of course, you want those funds to be spent in a human rights way. That would be important. But it's also that a tax policy, a tax incentive like Act 20 and 22 would be examined for their human rights consistency and compliance. When you invite in wealthy people using tax incentives to come and live half a year in Puerto Rico and not necessarily create employment and not necessarily create affordable housing, does Act 20 and 22, does that contribute to the right to housing, or does it take away? And so the human rights framework should be applied to all policies and laws and provisions that could have an impact on housing. I want to just say one more thing about what's required of governments under the right to housing. And then I'll just talk briefly about movements, a housing movement. It is understood that governments should adopt human rights-based housing plans or strategies. These are not a little policy here, a little program here. This should be an overarching strategy for how the population is going to be ensured access to safe, secure, and affordable housing. I wrote an entire thematic report that outlines what a rights-based housing strategy should look like. And so I'm not going to go into all those details. You can look up the report. It's very clear and it outlines all of the measures. But those are very important because it is in that strategy that governments and all levels of government can write these strategies. It's in the strategy that the government can make it very clear to third-party actors and the private sector what the government's intentions are and what the government expects of third-party actors. It can be outlined very clearly there. I also like the idea of pushing for human rights-based strategies because it gives communities something to rally around, like you've already done in Puerto Rico, rallying around a no eviction, no foreclosure evictions legislation or policy. It's very important to have these big pieces to rally around, come together and use as your advocacy piece. You can be advocating for a lot or a little, but if you have something to gather around, it makes it so much easier, obviously, so much more practical. In terms of how to start a movement, well, I think that you already know, and here we are, and I think you've already started a movement. Ariadna, I mean, you've talked to me about the work that you've done and others have done on this piece of legislation and trying, I think it's legislation, trying to have it understood that evictions must be ceased, especially post-June. I think it's the end of June when the moratorium gets lifted, and that's obviously a very scary time. That's not so far from now, and you need something much longer term. I mean, governments are doing what I call a ping pong approach to some fundamentals around the right to housing. Here, a moratorium today, gone tomorrow, back up today, gone tomorrow. People can't live like that in that ping pong way. People need long-term security. We know this. For human well-being, we know this, and the pandemic, of course, has exposed it very clearly. But I'll just reiterate that I think you're on the path to creating a vibrant movement. I do think you need goals, and I think you have set some already that could be used. I think the idea of a homegrown Puerto Rican housing strategy that is rights-based could be helpful or useful. I think you need to harness your allies that are within the territory, but that are in the mainland in the United States and also internationally. And, you know, here I am the shift is here, and you can call on us for international support in your movement, because sometimes it's helpful to have people on the outside looking in saying, excuse me, what is happening in Puerto Rico and why is this happening when it is part of the richest country in the world, or that now people say the 5th richest country in the world, if you look, depending on how you measure wealth. I do think it is absolutely, and this is my final comment, I do think it's imperative that your movement be based in a framework of accountability. And I know no other framework than the human rights framework that gives you that accountability. The United States has signed and ratified international treaty. They have made political treaties like the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, like the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Both of those international instruments are legal instruments, and you can hold your governments accountable to those instruments. Your president said very recently that housing is a right. Call him on it. He is moving in the right direction, but he cannot forget about Puerto Rico. And he cannot forget that it is the corporate actors that are destroying the housing landscape and the housing affordability landscape in the United States of America and in Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Thank you, Leilani. And I think we're able to clap and to thank you for your words. There are a couple of questions coming in. Some of them are different from what we expected. So I'm going to start with a few that we had on the pipeline. I certainly appreciate, we have people that have been working with Caño Martín Peña for a long time here, and the Caño is a proof of how people's power are able not only to develop a community land trust, but also to be a model for a lot of human rights and housing rights organizing in Puerto Rico. So I truly appreciate and I welcome the people from El Caño that are here. I also appreciate the fact that we're able to put this conversation in the context of Puerto Rico. We're going to be having international, exchanges here, but it's amazing also to speak about the way that the housing crisis looks like in a colony, in a special, jurisdiction, as you called it. Two questions just to start. Going back to the issue of accountability. What does remedy, what does reparation looks like in terms of housing, of the right to housing? What is the systemic change that we can achieve through human rights? It's an easy one.
Not easy, but normally I do a piece when I'm talking, and I didn't today, and I'm not sure why, so my apologies. I should have talked about this. The human rights framework actually, though I do not consider it to be radical, it's quite old. It comes from the 40s and the 60s, so it's kind of old. But it does have the ability to fundamentally alter the relationship between the state and people. And the reason it fundamentally alters that relationship is, and I think this is well articulated in your 4-point or 5-point, your 5-point letter that you want people to subscribe to. And of course, I would endorse that completely and wholly. Human rights recognize that human rights are inherent to people because we are human. That's why they call them human rights. It's about human beings, and they attach to us simply because we are human. And it alters the relationship between the state and the individual, because suddenly individuals become rights holders, not illegal encroachers on land, not criminals, not at best charity cases. We are rights holders. And when we say, like the people in Puerto Rico who are living without formal title, when you say, these are my lands, you are making a human rights claim. You are a human rights defender. And governments are obligated to fulfill the human rights of people. And so every act of government, every policy, every program that touches on housing has to ensure that rights holders are benefiting from the right to housing. It's a complete, if you think about it, it is completely opposite to the way in which most housing policy programs evolve. I mean, the clearing of informal settlements, the selling off of informal settlement land to speculators, that shows no understanding that the people on the lands are rights holders. It shows the opposite. It shows that the state will do what it wants and allow private actors to do what they want. And so that is the key to this human rights approach, is re-articulating for the state that you are rights holders and that you are rights defenders and you are making rights claims. And from there will flow, reparations is a very particular legal term, and so I don't know if that's what the question was getting at, that particular legal term, but certainly from there flows the idea that people cannot be forcibly evicted off the lands they are occupying, that there are right of return laws and principles that must be implemented if for some reason a population does have to be removed temporarily from lands. They have the right to return, the right to inhabit the homes they were living in or something equal to the homes they were living in. So everything flows, but you have, the starting point is that the people are rights holders. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, yes, it does. And there's a related question here, and it's about the U.S. Failure to ratify ISESCA, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. First, what's the consequence on that? And that's important because that's one of the main answers that we get when we're speaking about the right to housing. And for people who are not from Puerto Rico, something that has been mentioned but needs to be amplified is the fact that our Constitution included a Section 20 that cherished the right to housing, and it was eliminated by the U.S. Congress as a condition for us to have finally a constitution. So that's like an important fact. So what's the consequence of lack of ratification? And also going back, Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico is pushing legislation to stop evictions and foreclosures at times of disasters. We have had strong support, but yet both co-ops and banks oppose the measure, going back to equity as the main reason. What are you seeing in terms of legislation, and what is the power? And I know you talk a little bit about this. What is the power, of trying to push a bill as a tool for advocacy and organizing work? So those two.
Sure. I would never let the fact that the United States has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights stand in the way of your advocacy. Absolutely not. And that's in part, we can thank the COVID-19 pandemic for this. We cannot thank it for almost anything, but we can thank it for this. It has exposed very clearly the relationship between the right to life and the right to housing, and the right to security and the right to housing. And the right to life and the right to security are included in international instruments that the United States has ratified. And the Human Rights Committee, so that's a committee of independent experts within the UN system, has said very clearly in a comment, it's called General Comment 36, they made the connection between housing and the right to life, and homelessness and the right to life. And then, of course, the pandemic itself has exposed. That's why we had stay-at-home orders, on the belief that the home can protect you from a deadly virus that could kill you. And so there's no going back now from that understanding of the essential role that home can play. Not everyone has been protected by their home in this pandemic, and we well understand that. People living in grossly inadequate housing, and of course, people living in poverty have not been protected through the home, and women experiencing violence as well as others. But we know there's that symbiotic relationship now between home and the right to life. And so you have the legal protections at the international level and domestically that you need to argue for the right to housing. I wouldn't let it stop you. There are people like AOC, Congresswoman AOC, who are alive to the fact that the United States should ratify this international instrument. But for me, that's another struggle. That's a separate struggle. Don't let it stop you from your work. In terms of, let's see, there were lots of questions here. I didn't know this about the retraction of the right to housing from the Puerto Rican Constitution. That's very telling. And so that is obviously disturbing and something that has to be addressed. But I've been arguing recently that we can go very far with a legislated right to housing, that we don't need it in constitutions necessarily to move forward. And so, for example, in Canada, we also do not have the right to housing in our constitution. And when we advocates were trying to move forward the right to housing here, we knew we could not have constitutional reform. It wasn't going to happen. It's a very complicated process in a federal state like Canada. And so we set our sights on legislation that could protect the right to housing. And what we did was we set our sights on national level legislation that attached to national level government. What we did was we secured legislation that says it is the housing policy of the government of Canada to recognize that housing is a human right. And that then enables us to argue that any time national level government spends money at the local or territorial level, they have to spend that money in a way that is human rights compliant, because they said their housing policy at the national level recognizes housing as a human right. And you could play with this as well within your own situation as a territory of the United States. You could be asking HUD to recognize housing as a human right within its own purview or its own domain. I'm really brainstorming here, so this might be ludicrous, but there are ways to get around these constitutional denials of the right to housing, is what I want to say. Lastly, we need to find friendly banks, friendly co-ops, and friendly investors who actually do understand how important home is and security is. And they may not be there on the shores of Puerto Rico, but I know they exist because I'm in conversation with some of them, at least in some countries. And they come to me, they're sometimes very small. We need them to, small investors, small housing developers, small real estate entities. We need them to start speaking up. I know there's a group out in California, for example, that have been working with banks and getting banks in San Francisco, getting banks to deny loans to investors who are going to flip properties and make them more expensive. And so let's connect with that group let's connect you with that group in San Francisco. Let's get the banks that are quietly denying loans to speak up and say, we've decided we're not going to give loans to big investors that ruin people's lives. They won't say it like that, but I do think we have to start harnessing the good within those fields that are doing so much damage. Lastly, organizing around a tool, a bill, I think is fundamental. I think it is the best way to organize. It is such a learning process for everyone. It's a way to get down and dirty with the right to housing. It's a way to get to know what people know, what people don't know, what legislators are fearing, their myths and stereotypes around what this all means. So I think it's a brilliant way to go.
Yeah, and if you're interested in legislations and some of the work that people are doing, we're going to be talking a little bit about policies that some groups here are trying to push or have been able to push in the last few years. If you want to know more about the bill that Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico has been working on, for sure Camilo and Veronica in the next panels are going to be talking about it. Before reading, going back to one of the questions right now about capitalism, I'm going to read it completely. I wanted to remind you all that the manifest or the manifiesto is available for institutional endorsements. We thank people like Idebajo, Proyecto Matria, Urbe a Pie, Mujeres de Isla en Culebra, National Housing Law Project, Movement Lola, Fundación Sarabá, Cooperativa Brújula, and many others who have signed into the manifest that it's going to turn, or that it's going to adopt different initiatives that different groups are pushing in order to become an action plan for the next couple of years. Leilani, here is a question about capitalism, and it's at the root of housing inequity. So thank you, Kathy, for it. So it says, is it enough to demand our human rights for housing in a framework of capitalism? I don't believe capitalism can provide housing for all. How can we question property rights? Should land property be a commodity?
I get asked this question a lot, and for those of you who have seen Push the film, you will maybe know my answer, and my answer can be considered controversial, which is fine. What I want to say is that I believe capitalism can be responsive to human rights. And I feel like we haven't tried this yet. When have we tried? Where have we tried to get capitalism to be responsive to human rights? Where is all this human right to housing legislation requiring capitalism to interact with it? We're at the beginning of something here. The Shift, my organization, is using human rights as a direct challenge to the uber or over commodification of housing. Let's see how we go. Let's give it a shot before we try to bring down capitalism. Now, that doesn't mean that I think profit-driven housing will meet the needs of entire populations. Of course not. We need a social safety net of housing in every society. We need social or public housing in every society. What that looks like is going to vary. Does it have to be state provided? I think not. I think it could be community provided. I think you're already doing that in some of your communities in Puerto Rico. And so you don't want, I don't want to see all of this as being about state provision, state support, yes. Whether it's through resources, through land, through titling systems, through the provision of water, sanitation, and electricity, yes. But I'm very clear that profit-driven housing will not support the entire population. Absolutely. But I'm also clear that dismantling capitalism is a very large endeavor that will receive, that will be very difficult to implement. Can I try to make capitalism responsive to human rights? I'd like to give it a go.
Thank you. Some people are sending me directly questions, but if you want to go ahead and share it, we also shared Push, the film. I hope we have a few minutes so that you can go through, talk to us a little bit about the documentary. Here is Push the film. We are sharing once again the link. I know some of you asked about the podcast. The podcast is called Pushback Talks. Leilani, could you walk us through a little bit about those outlets and how are you using them right now to amplify the work, your previous work as a special rapporteur, but now as the director of the Shift? Is it different? Can you reach more people? Does it work better?
Yeah, so a lot of people think that I commissioned the film Push for my work, and I did not, and that's probably why it was so successful. I was approached by an independent filmmaker. His name is Fredrik Gertten. He's from Sweden. I think that also had something to do with the success of the film, not just because he's an award-winning filmmaker, but there's something about Swedes. They're highly respected for their commitment to human well-being, even though as I've gotten to know Sweden, I realize, in fact, it's kind of a ruthless country and they don't recognize the right to housing, but Fredrik certainly does. So he approached me to make a film. He saw the work I was doing on the financialization of housing. He himself had been troubled because everywhere he was going, he was hearing people say that they couldn't afford housing in every city he went to. And he just decided, he's an inquisitive, curious fellow, and he wanted to make a film to find out why. And then he saw my work and realized that there was perhaps a global pattern at play. So that's what the film really tries to expose, is the global nature of this. The fact that that the roots of financialization find themselves in Chile, and a dictator Pinochet rolling out neoliberalism is such an interesting element to this. The fact that pension funds in South Korea are investing in housing and residential real estate throughout the world, undermining the right to housing in many parts of the world, while the government of South Korea actually believes in the right to housing. So very interesting dots were connected through the film Push. We started rolling it out in 2019 through film festivals, and then in early 2020 through theatrical release in the UK. And then we were intended to have a theatrical release in April of 2020. But global pandemics do not allow for the release of films in theaters. And so we've been rolling it out in other ways through community screenings. In fact, we've been doing that a lot, even in 2019 and early 2020. So community screenings and post-screening panels, discussions to try to get people to really talk about these issues and understand how the issues that are in the film might be relevant on the ground. I mean, the film is so completely relevant to the Puerto Rican context. It's amazing to me and phenomenal. I think we can have some really rich discussions. I just think there's so much that could be done in Puerto Rico, that needs to be done, that must be done to save Puerto Rico from being completely financialized. I mean, you're in such, you know better than me, and you will know more. And I wish I could spend the next 2 days with you. I really do, because you're in a very precarious position, very precarious. I think you feel that. We started Pushback Talks as another way to just generate conversation and keep the conversation going. I'm really hoping, Ariadna, that you might consider joining an episode of Pushback Talks. I would love to have you on to talk about these issues. And Frederick speaks Spanish, so he'll make you feel comfortable. But we have to do it in English, unfortunately. But I think the world needs to hear about what's happening in Puerto Rico, and Pushback Talks is listened to in 108 countries. We have a growing listener audience, so we can get the word out. So, but it's just important that we keep communicating, and I'm trying as hard as I can to use different medium to do that, whether it's film or podcasts. I'm very active on Twitter. I tweeted this morning that I was coming to Puerto Rico. I actually would like to discuss with all of you at the end of your 2 days whether it would be useful for the shift to come to Puerto Rico once travel opens up again, to do a kind of high level, very visible research mission where we expose what we've learned. Old style, we used to do these fact-finding missions in the old days of human rights work, or like organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. They just never focused on housing. So the shift is trying to do that. We've done this to Buenos Aires in the middle of the pandemic. We did a virtual visit to Buenos Aires. But anyway, I have lots of ideas, so I'll stop there.
And that's amazing. And we are truly looking forward collaborating with you. Of course, I'm more than honored by the invitation. And I think that's something that has happened in the last few years in Puerto Rico, is that because disasters have been normalized, the hurricanes of 2017, then the earthquakes of 2020, Puerto Rico has become, a safe haven for investors, speculators. Let's not forget the $73 billion outstanding debt, and this image that people in Puerto Rico are guilty or are accountable. The relationship with the US, and this is important because although this is not about Puerto Rico has become a lab for policies that have to do with speculation, with public debt, with unsustainability. And when we try to articulate human rights, we found maybe the biggest boulder, and is saying or thinking that human rights have no voice, have no space in this conversation because of the position of Puerto Rico. For example, being colonized by the US, being denied being a colony by international forums like the UN itself, being like imposed a president that is not the president of Puerto Rico because Puerto Ricans have no vote. The questions of status and self-determination are just like, most times we know about them by advocacy work that others try to do, mostly grounded on solidarity, but also on the idea that the people in Puerto Rico will remain voiceless. So structural changes to ask for housing, going back to the idea that rights are always interdependent, are central at this moment. So we would be happy and grateful to have you. There are 2 questions. One of them is from one of our friends in Nigeria. Dennis, I'm gonna go back to you. I'm gonna read both of them at the same time. So the first one is Raul from the Center of New Economy. Raul hates it when I say this, but Raul is probably one of the brightest minds right now, doing that mapping, that, historical mapping about the way that access to housing has been going on in Puerto Rico. And we always thank him for his work. And he asks, how can communities use leverage to foster a new relationship with the state? This also has to do with capitalism, right? One that recognizes communities as peers in housing services and not as passive actors waiting for paternalistic policies. And the other one from Dennis, in Nigeria, government claims they own the land and only give certificate of occupancy to citizens. So they take over lands and pull down houses, evicting people, and in some cases, no compensation. In such case, what can one do? Do you really need to be a lawyer to be a human rights housing defender? We're with you, Dennis. Something very similar happens here. Thank you for your question. So Leilani.
I'm not sure I understood Raul's question. He wanted to know, how can communities use something to leverage?
Yeah, it's how can they use their influence?
Influence.
To leverage, yeah. And I think it has to do with the idea of, providing a service, like that charity of the state, instead of seeing people as people with agency, even in public housing context.
I mean, the people are never wrong. Communities are never wrong. So always change happens from communities. So I don't really, you have to articulate your claims and make claims as human rights claims and as human rights defenders. And I think there's a lot of examples from around the world where communities have stood their ground, literally in front of bulldozers, but also in front of politicians, and been fearless in their commitment to their human rights and defending their human rights. I think that you in Puerto Rico are actually very sophisticated in some ways, and already have so much in place. I think the work that I understand you're doing, Raul, from what Ariadna has just said, is very important. If you're mapping who owns Puerto Rico, who owns it, which companies, and doing that mapping. Yesterday a big report came out from 25 journalists across Europe who are doing that kind of work. Who, I think they called it something about rent in cities. Sorry, I can't remember the title, but they basically are mapping who owns the cities in Europe. And of course, they're finding, 700% increase in investment, et cetera. And those sorts of things, those sorts of facts can be very powerful as tools for communities to use to push back, to say, how is it that we live here, we work the land, we make our cities and our areas, communities function, and yet it's a firm in New York that actually is owning my home or my land, right? I'm not sure I got it at Raul's question, but I hope that's sufficient. And in terms of the question from Dennis, the second last official mission I did as UN rapporteur was to Nigeria, as a matter of fact. And so I'm well acquainted with the way in which Nigerian governments work evicting people. And no, you do not have to be a human rights lawyer to defend your lands. In fact, most people defending their lands around the world fighting evictions are not lawyers. Often they're helped by lawyers, and in Lagos there are some really adept lawyers doing really good work defending against evictions, and have as a result of their work with communities, harnessing the energy and mobilization of communities, because the people are never wrong, have managed to get some good judgments around evictions and when they can happen and when they can't and under what conditions. Now, then the next step is ensuring good judgments are implemented, because that, governments just ignore the courts in a country like Nigeria. And so, but community mobilizing to defend against evictions is key, and it doesn't take human rights lawyers, it takes human rights claimants, which all of you are. To make this work.
Definitely. Also, and I want to like to go back and stress that, because sometimes this is a conversation. Sorry.
Okay.
Sometimes this is a conversation monopolized by lawyers and by attorneys. And, you know, one of our core values, and this is part of being movement lawyers and human rights lawyer, is acknowledging that law is usually unfair, is usually unjust, and that it perpetuates the inequity. And in regards to the right to housing, you know, when people see a lawyer, it's usually to evict you, it's usually to foreclose your house, it's usually to tell you that you have a right not to be there. So promoting strength in community paralegals, promoting strength in what is called barefoot lawyers, promoting strength, you know, in the work of people who know the law and who are in a better position to transform the law because of anger, because of hope, because of knowledge. It's a great opportunity for the right to housing. I also wanted to commend, I don't know if he's here, but Matthew Burnett from Open Society Foundations, from the Justice Initiative, and Namati have been great allies in designing what is now the first housing and displacement and climate justice paralegal program in Puerto Rico, which is like part of the work that Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico is doing this year, and that Frances, who's here, and Veronica are shaping together with the rest of the team. So having community paralegals who are able to articulate human rights demands. And you said something, Leilani, which is very important. People know that they have rights. People know that they are entitled to it. How do you transform that into collective action is a promise of the work that we are trying to do. Leilani, time is betraying us. I don't know if you have some final thoughts. Of course, we want you to be in Puerto Rico. We're going to be talking right after this space. If you have like final comments, please.
I don't want to take up more time, only to say that, again, I want to reiterate, I do think Puerto Rico is in a very precarious situation. And I think any actions you take to save homes and lands for the people of Puerto Rico will be important and a huge contribution. I think we're in a different place now. I believe I'm a reader of landscapes. I mean, as rapporteur from 2014 to 2020, and now I spend a lot of time reading the mood, not of the room, but of the planet. What is the mood of the planet? And my sense is we are in a different place now where there is traction on the issues that you are focusing on for the next 2 days, this financialization of housing. There is pushback happening in so many places around the world. The people are not wrong. And so I think that now is such a good time to move forward with your work. I know that you need allies and supporters, and I want to reiterate that the shift is here. I am here. You can use people like me, and there's many. I'm not the only one. There's other people out there who are now being listened to a little more than we used to be. And you should be using us and calling on us to use our privileged position, to use our ability to have doors open, to support your work. And I am more than happy to do that. As I think many of you know, I live, breathe, sleep, eat the right to housing these days, because it's so central to human dignity and human life. So I'm with you. And good luck in your next 2 days. I really wish if I'd really thought about it, I would have cleared my decks to be with you for the full 2 days. But hopefully some of it will be recorded and I can catch up later. Thank you so much for inviting me to this important conversation.
Thank you, and I want us all like to thank Leilani for being here. Leilani, looking forward, we will talk. Madeline will write to you and Keith as soon as possible so that we can keep in touch and schedule. So we are more than glad, more than happy for this exchange. Thank you all for joining, for tuning in.